It's September 6, 1939, in Krakow, Poland. 17-year-old Leah Rosner was sitting by the window, sketching wildflowers into the margins of her worn poetry book, when she heard the knock. Sharp, urgent. Not the kind of knock a neighbor gives, not the kind that brings good news. She froze. Her pencil trembled against the page, leaving an unintentional dark streak across her carefully drawn cornflower. Outside, the late summer sun was setting, casting long shadows across their modest street in the Jewish quarter. Just days ago, German forces had invaded Poland, and the radio broadcasts had grown increasingly dire. Their neighbors, the Wassersteins, had fled 2 nights before, heading east with only what they could carry. Leah glanced across the room at her mother, who had been mending a pair of David's trousers. The needle hovered mid-stitch as Esther's eyes met her daughter's. Time seemed to stop in that shared moment of terror. Her father, Jacob, looked up from the kitchen table where he was mending a torn satchel, the lines on his face deepening. His weathered hands, strong from years of working leather, stilled. Before the war, his small shop had provided comfortable living for them. Now, like so many Jewish businesses, it had been vandalized, the windows smashed, anti-Semitic slurs painted across the door. Her mother, Esther, instinctively drew her 10-year-old son David close, clutching him like he might disappear. David had been playing with a set of wooden blocks on the floor, constructing elaborate buildings that existed only in his imagination. Now, sensing the tension, he remained motionless in his mother's embrace, his dark eyes wide with unspoken questions. Outside, the sound of Nazi boots echoed on the cobbled street, harsh, cruel, deliberate. The rhythmic march had become the soundtrack of their nightmares. Leah counted the footsteps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Too many to be just a patrol. This was a squad with purpose. The knock came again, louder, more insistent, like a fist against the fragile veneer of safety. The wood of their door seemed to shudder inward, as if it might splinter from the force. "Perhaps they'll go away," Esther whispered, her voice barely audible. But they all knew better. The Germans were nothing if not methodical. Jakob stood slowly, straightening his shoulders with a dignity that broke Leah's heart. He adjusted his yarmulke, a small act of defiance. "Don't move," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Remember what we discussed. If anything happens—" "Papa, no," Leah interrupted, rising to her feet. But he silenced her with a gentle look. They had indeed discussed this moment, planned for it in hushed conversations after David was asleep. The emergency bag was packed, hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the pantry. Inside were their identity papers, what little money they had saved, and a small map marking the route to Esther's cousin in the countryside. Jakob crossed the room with deliberate steps, each one seeming to echo in the silence that had fallen over their home. He paused at the door, took a deep breath and smoothed his thinning hair with one hand. He opened the door to find 3 SS officers. Their faces were blank. Masks of efficiency, their black uniforms immaculate, silver skulls gleaming on their caps. Behind them stood 2 Polish policemen, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "Jakob Rosner?" the tallest officer asked, consulting a list. His German accent mangled their surname. "Yes," Jakob replied quietly. "You have 30 minutes to pack your belongings," the officer snapped in German. "1 suitcase per person, no more than 25 kilograms each. The Rosners are to be relocated." Relocated? The word scraped like glass. Leah felt her throat tighten. She knew what it meant. For weeks they had heard whispers about the ghetto being constructed across the river, a prison for Jews, sealed off from the rest of the city. The officer continued, "All valuables must be declared. Failure to comply will result in immediate punishment." His cold eyes swept the apartment, taking inventory. "We will return precisely at 8 o'clock. He checked his watch with exaggerated precision. "Be ready." As the soldiers moved on to the next apartment, Jakob shut the door with shaking hands. For a moment he leaned against it, as if his body could barricade them from what was coming. Then he straightened, turned to Esther, then to his children. "We're not going," he said, his voice low but firm. David broke free from his mother's embrace. "But Papa," they said. Jakob knelt before his son, placing his hands on the boy's narrow shoulders. "Listen to me, David. Those men, they are not taking us somewhere safe. We cannot trust them." "Where will we go?" Esther asked, her voice breaking. Jacob looked up at his wife, then at his daughter. His eyes, always so warm and full of laughter, were now resolute. "We're hiding." Rumors had become warnings. Warnings had become truths. Relocation meant ghettos, or worse. People vanished. Trains left with screams and came back silent. For months, Jacob had listened to the clandestine radio broadcasts, heard the whispered stories passed between shopkeepers. Jews in Germany had already disappeared by the thousands. Now Poland's turn had come. The signs were unmistakable. The yellow stars they were forced to wear, the curfews, the steadily increasing restrictions that squeezed their lives smaller each day. Leah had watched her father grow quieter with each passing week, had seen him exchange meaningful glances with other men at synagogue. She had noticed how he'd taken to walking different routes home, how he'd begun teaching David to memorize addresses and names of people he'd never met. Contingencies, lifelines. Jacob had long feared this moment. That night, under a moonless sky, he waited until the patrol had passed their street before slipping out the back window. Leah watched from behind the blackout curtains as his shadow melted into the darkness. Esther busied herself packing only the essentials: warm clothes, family photographs, Jacob's prayer book, David's medicine for his asthma. "Where is Papa going?" David asked, his small voice tight with anxiety. "To find us safety," Leah answered, pulling her brother close. "Remember how Papa always says God provides?" 2 hours later, Jacob returned, his face drawn but determined. He knocked on a door he never thought he'd have to, his old friend and co-worker, Marek Zielinski, a quiet Catholic man who lived alone above a shuttered tailor shop on Bernardinska Street, near the river. They had worked together for 15 years before the war, when Jacob's leatherwork had been commissioned by Marek's tailoring clientele. Marek was pushing 60, his back bent from years hunched over a sewing machine, his fingers permanently stained with dye. His wife had died years before, and his children had moved to France before the invasion. He lived modestly, attracting little attention. A perfect hiding place. Marek didn't hesitate when Jacob explained their situation. The old friendship transcended the madness that had engulfed their world. "There's an attic, above my flat. Small, but no one uses it. You can't make a sound, not ever. The walls are thin, neighbors might hear." He fished a skeleton key from his pocket, pressing it into Jacob's palm. "I'll bring food when I can, but not even my wife can know." By candlelight, Jacob and Marek gathered supplies: old blankets, a chamber pot, a small barrel for water. Marek sacrificed his winter provisions: jars of preserves, dried sausages, a sack of potatoes. They worked silently, efficiency born of desperation. "The Germans come to search sometimes," Marek warned, showing Jacob how the attic hatch was concealed by a false ceiling panel. "If they come, don't breathe. They brought dogs last time." That same night, they moved. The Rosners slipped through back gardens, through a cemetery, finally to Marek's building. They avoided main streets, froze at the sound of every vehicle. David stumbled once, and Jacob carried him the rest of the way, the boy's face buried against his father's shoulder to stifle his frightened tears. The attic was a slanted crawl space, barely tall enough to sit upright in the center. Dust choked the air, dancing in the feeble beam of Marek's flashlight. Cobwebs hung like ghostly curtains from the rafters. The wooden beams groaned with age. A small, dirty window was painted black on the outside, a standard blackout precaution that now served as perfect camouflage. But beyond all these disadvantages, it was shelter. "It gets cold in winter," Marek whispered apologetically. "Very cold, and hot in summer. But it's dry, and they've searched downstairs twice now, never found this." Jacob lifted David first, then Esther. Leah followed, heart pounding, clutching a satchel filled with family photos, a cracked fountain pen, and a notebook she swore she'd one day fill. As she climbed the narrow ladder, she realized this might be the last time she felt fresh air for a very long time. She took a deep breath, trying to memorize the sensation. Marek passed them bread, water, and wool blankets. "I'll come after dark," he whispered. "Every night if I can. If I miss a night, don't panic. Sometimes they watch the building. No one must see you. No sound during the day, none. He showed them how to use rags to muffle the scrape of the hatch, how the floorboards near the edges creaked less, where to place the chamber pot so odors wouldn't seep downward, how to communicate with him through gentle taps on the ceiling of his apartment. 1 for danger, 2 for urgent need, 3 for all clear. "God be with you," he said, his eyes damp in the candlelight. Then the hatch closed and darkness swallowed them completely. For several minutes no one moved. No one spoke. They simply breathed, adjusting to their new reality. Leah felt her mother's hand find hers in the blackness, squeezing with silent reassurance. Finally, Jacob struck a match, lighting a single candle. The small flame revealed their new home, 16 square meters of dusty floor space, a prison of their own choosing. "We will survive this," he said simply, the candlelight making his shadow enormous against the sloped ceiling. "We will live to see God's light again." The days were endless. Time, once measured by school bells and Shabbat candles, by seasons and celebrations, now stretched like taffy. Hours became geological epochs. Minutes crawled. Seconds ticked by with excruciating slowness, marked only by the muted sounds filtering up from the streets below. A cart's wheel on cobblestone, a distant automobile, the changing of the guard at the checkpoint 3 blocks away. They lay still for hours, barely daring to breathe. Leah developed a new relationship with her own body. Every swallow was deafening. Every stomach growl a betrayal. Every sneeze a potential catastrophe. She learned to move like water, fluid and silent, to distribute her weight evenly across the ancient floorboards, to anticipate which spots might creak under pressure. Each creak from below was a potential death sentence. The bark of a dog, the metal clang of boots on stairs. Leah began to count those sounds. She tracked time by fear. 47 footsteps from the street door to Marek's apartment, 3 minutes and 20 seconds for a patrol to pass. 8 hours without a single human sound. The blessed dead of night, when they could finally whisper to each other, could finally stretch their cramped limbs. They divided the attic into rooms, using their imaginations and careful placement of their few possessions. The northeast corner became the kitchen, a small crate where they kept their meager provisions. The southwest corner served as a washroom, the chamber pot discreetly covered with a cloth. The center, where the ceiling was highest, became the living area where they could occasionally sit upright during the night hours. Esther established strict routines. Water was rationed to 3 small cups per person per day. Waste was disposed of only after midnight, through the tiny window, when the night patrol had passed. Clothes were to be worn 3 days in succession before rotating to preserve their limited wardrobe. Marek came nightly, as promised. His arrivals became the framework of their existence. Bread, a few potatoes. Once he smuggled a tin of jam, which Esther spread on crusts like gold. She rationed everything, even sips of water, with mathematical precision. A quarter slice of bread for breakfast, half a potato for dinner. On Shabbat, a sliver of jam as celebration. "We must keep the Sabbath," Jacob insisted on their first Friday in hiding, "even here, especially here." So Esther would save a bit of candle and they would whisper prayers in the darkness. David struggled the most. 10 years old and bursting with energy, confinement was torture. He fidgeted constantly until Esther taught him to count his breaths. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. Sometimes he would forget himself and begin to speak at normal volume, causing Jacob to clamp a gentle but firm hand over his mouth. David asked questions Leah couldn't answer. "Where's my school? When can we go outside? Why are they doing this? How long will we stay here?" The last question haunted them all. Weeks? Months? Surely not years. The Allies would come. America would enter the war. Someone would stop this madness. So Leah told stories, fairy tales, myths, dreams of lands with no war, where boys could run and mothers didn't cry into their sleeves. She described the colors of spring flowers to David, who closed his eyes to imagine them better. She recited poetry from memory, the words floating in the darkness like fireflies. She invented elaborate adventures, starring David as the hero, a clever boy who could outsmart any villain, climb any mountain, solve any puzzle. At night, when David slept, Curled against their mother for warmth, Leah also began to write. The candle was precious, not to be wasted, so she wrote by feel, by memory, her pencil scratching softly against the page, fragments, feelings, sometimes just a single word that captured the day. Day 6. I miss sun on my skin. I miss laughing. Today a spider built a web in the corner. I named her Matilda and decided she's our roommate now. She catches flies. I am grateful for her work. Day 12. David counted to 1,000 in his head today. He says numbers keep him company. Papa taught us a silent game with fingers that made us all smile. Mama smiling is rare now. Day 19. The couple downstairs fought today. We could hear every word. The woman wants to leave Poland. The man says it's too dangerous. I wonder if they know we can hear them. I wonder if they would turn us in. The ink bled like truth across the pages, a record of their diminished existence, proof they were still alive when the world outside seemed determined to erase them. Day 25. I had a dream of flying, of soaring above Krakow, seeing everything from above, German tanks, hiding families, secret places. In my dream, I could warn everyone. I woke up crying. Papa held my hand until I fell back asleep. Slowly, imperceptibly, they adapted, bodies adjusted to discomfort, minds calibrated to confinement. And underneath it all, a flame of hope refused to die. That someday this would end, that someday they would walk in sunlight again. By November, frost crept across the tiny attic window. The wind howled like a beast outside, finding every crack and crevice in the aged roof, sending icy fingers through the inadequate insulation. The temperature dropped precipitously, their breath clouded before their faces, spectral evidence of their forbidden existence. What had been merely uncomfortable in autumn became dangerous in winter. The cold didn't arrive gradually, it invaded, an occupying force as merciless as the soldiers below. The attic, with its thin walls and gaps in the roofing, offered little resistance. They slept curled together, sharing breath for warmth. Jakob's hands turned red, the skin splitting at the knuckles. His fingers, once nimble enough to stitch the finest leather, grew stiff and clumsy. He would rub them together silently for hours, trying to maintain circulation. Sometimes Leah would take his hands between hers, warming them as he had done for her when she was small. Esther coughed at night, muffling it in rags. What began as a tickle in her throat developed into something deeper, more worrisome. She hid it well, turning away when the spasms came, pressing her face into the blanket to silence the sound. But Leah noticed how her mother's shoulders shook, how each breath seemed to catch at the end. "It's nothing," Esther would whisper when Leah asked, "just the dust." But her eyes told a different story. Leah gave David her only wool socks. She wrapped his feet in her scarf and kissed his cheeks until they warmed. His asthma, always worse in cold air, threatened to betray them all. Sometimes he would begin to wheeze, and Esther would hold him close, whispering in his ear, coaching his breathing until the attack subsided. They developed a system for keeping warm. During the day, they would huddle under all their blankets, conserving body heat. At night, when movement was safer, they would take turns doing silent exercises, knee bends, arm circles, careful stretches, anything to get blood flowing without making noise. Jakob fashioned insulation from old newspapers Marek smuggled up. They stuffed these into the worst gaps, plugging holes where frigid drafts penetrated. It helped marginally. Marek brought firewood, risking arrest. Small, dry pieces that would burn hot and fast with minimal smoke. He built tiny fires in a tin pail that they snuffed before sunrise. Smoke could kill them. But so could the cold. "It is the worst winter in a decade," Marek reported in hushed tones. "The river has frozen solid. People are burning furniture for heat." The fire was their most dangerous comfort. They allowed themselves this risk only on the coldest nights, when the temperature plummeted below freezing and David's lips would turn faintly blue. Jakob would watch the flame with hawk-like intensity, ready to extinguish it at the first sound from below. The small container of water they kept ready for this purpose sometimes froze overnight. December brought snowfall that blanketed the city in deceptive beauty. Through the tiny window, Leah could see a patch of sky and the tops of buildings transformed into a winter wonderland. The snow provided unexpected blessing, better insulation on the roof, and a muffling effect on the sounds of the street. But it also meant tracks could betray Marek's nightly visits. He became more cautious, sometimes missing nights when the risk seemed too great. Hanukkah came, no menorah, no dreidel, no latkes. But Jacob had saved tiny scraps of candle, and they whispered the blessings in darkness, commemorating the miracle of light during the shortest, darkest days of the year. Leah held David as he silently wept, missing the celebrations of years past. Next year, Jacob promised, we will celebrate properly, with family, with freedom. Outside, the Krakow ghetto was sealed. Marek reported the horror with a broken voice, families crammed into single rooms, people starving, typhus spreading like wildfire. The walls around the ghetto grew higher. Guards shot those who approached. They're saying all Jews must be in the ghetto now, Marek whispered one night, his face grim in the faint candlelight. House searches are becoming more frequent. They're offering rewards for information about hidden Jews. Then came the trains. Marek didn't need to explain. They heard them in the distance, the heavy clank of metal, the sickening whistle. Departing full, returning empty. Where are they taking them? David asked. No one answered. Christmas passed without acknowledgement. New Year came, 1940. They had been in the attic for nearly 4 months, and the world outside had transformed into something unrecognizable. A place of snow and silence, of fear and complicity, of neighbors who no longer met each other's eyes. In January, the temperature dropped further. Ice formed inside the window. The water in their barrel developed a frozen crust that Jakob had to break each morning. They could no longer feel their toes. Frostbite became a new enemy to fight. Leah developed chilblains on her fingers, red swollen patches that itched unbearably. She bit her lip to keep from scratching them. David's asthma worsened, his breathing becoming a soft wheeze that terrified them all. Esther's cough deepened. They passed the long hours by telling each other elaborate stories of warmth, of beaches and deserts, of steam rooms and hot springs. They described summer days so vividly they could almost feel sweat on their brows. Almost. When we get out, David whispered one particularly frigid night, I'm going to stand in the sun until I'm brown as a nut. When we get out, Leah added, I'm going to take the hottest bath in history. When we get out, Jacob said softly, we're going to America, where it's safe. They all knew better than to ask if. Only when. To say if was to invite despair, and despair was a luxury they could not afford. January 1940. The boots returned, louder this time, directly below. Marek had warned them, rumors of a search. The Germans were conducting house-by-house inspections, methodically working their way through the neighborhood. A family had been discovered 3 streets over, hidden in a false wall. They were dragged out into the snow, shot on the spot as an example. The bodies were left for days as warning. That morning had begun like any other in their confined existence. They had sipped their meager water ration, shared a crust of bread that had grown stale and hard. Jacob had led them in silent prayer. David had been engaged in his counting game, mouthing numbers without sound, his fingers tracing patterns in the dust beside him. Then came the pounding on the front door below. Not a knock, but a demand. The universal language of authority. They listened, frozen, as soldiers stormed the building, yelling. Doors kicked in, glass shattering. The thud of furniture being overturned, walls being rapped for hollow spaces. The unmistakable sound of rifle butts against surfaces, seeking the telltale echo of hidden compartments. A woman was screaming on the first floor, Mrs. Kowalski, the baker's widow. Leah had bought bread from her for years. Her voice rose in terrified protest, then was silently cut off. David whimpered. Esther wrapped him in her arms, one hand clamped firmly but gently over his mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror, but her face remained composed for her son's sake. Jacob braced his body against the hatch, though they all knew it would be futile if the Germans discovered the concealed entrance. His muscles trembled with the strain of remaining absolutely still while supporting his weight against the wood. Leah lay flat on the floor, trembling, heart slamming in her chest like a drum. She could feel each heartbeat in her throat, worried the sound was audible beyond her body. She stared fixedly at a knot in the wooden beam above her, focusing on its swirled pattern, trying to separate herself from the moment. If these were her final conscious minutes, she didn't want them filled only with fear. She thought of her friend Rivka, who had been taken to the ghetto in October, of her teacher, Mr. Abramson, who had taught her to love poetry, of the boy down the street, Eli, who had once left flowers on her windowsill. Where were they now? Were they still alive? Would anyone remember the Rosners if they were discovered today? Footsteps climbed the stairs, heavy boots, multiple sets. 3 soldiers, Leah guessed from the rhythm. They were being thorough, stopping on each landing, the creak of doors being forced open on the floor below them, the crash of a cabinet being toppled. "Clear," a gruff voice called in German. The boots continued upward, directly below the attic now, in Marek's apartment. Leah closed her eyes. Her mother had taught her the Shema, the most sacred prayer in Judaism, to recite in times of great danger. She repeated it silently now, her lips forming the words without sound. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." They stopped on the floor below, a silence thick with dread. Voices, questions, Marek answering, his tone measured, respectful, a perfect performance of the compliant citizen with nothing to hide. "You live alone, old man?" A harsh voice, skeptical. "Yes, sir, since my Hannah died 3 years ago." "Any visitors? Anyone staying here?" "No, sir, just me." "You're a tailor?" "Yes, sir, though there isn't much work now." Silence again, the sound of movement, searching. Leah could picture it, drawers emptied onto floors, mattresses slashed, floorboards inspected. Then a question that froze their blood. "What's that up there?" A different voice, sharper, more alert. A pause, Marek's voice, still calm, but with an edge of tension only those who knew him would detect. "Just the roof space, sir. For storage. Empty now." "Open it." Leah's eyes flew to her father's. Jakob's face had gone grey, but his jaw was set. He slowly moved his hand to signal Esther, be ready to cover David's mouth completely if necessary. His other hand slipped into his pocket, where Leah knew he kept a small knife. Not to fight, that would be suicide, but perhaps to ensure his family didn't suffer worse fates. Marek's voice again, a masterpiece of casual dismissal. "It's been sealed for years, sir. After the roof leak, mold up there, dangerous to breathe. Health department ordered it closed." A beat of silence, contemplation. "The whole building has been inspected." The first voice again. "Yes, sir, all clear." A new voice, another soldier reporting in. Then, miracle of miracles, retreat. The sound faded, boots descending the stairs, orders being called, vehicles starting outside. They stayed frozen for hours afterward. No one moved, no one spoke, barely breathing. The sun set, casting the attic into deeper shadow, but still they remained motionless, fearful of a trap. Only when Marek gave their signal, 3 soft taps on the ceiling, did Jakob finally shift his weight from the hatch. His legs gave out, and he collapsed silently onto the floor. Esther released David, whose eyes were wide with understanding beyond his years. He had not made a sound. Leah felt tears slide silently down her face, not of fear now, but of bone-deep relief and lingering terror. They had survived by the thinnest margin, by Marek's quick thinking, by luck or God's grace or both. That night, Marek brought them an extra piece of bread and news. The search had been city-wide, 17 families discovered, none spared. "They're getting better at finding hiding places," he warned. "We need to be more careful. I'll come less often, every other night. Less chance of establishing a pattern." Before leaving, he showed Jacob a new precaution, a false board he'd installed that would make the attic hatch appear sealed from below. "Extra protection," he whispered, "just in case." After he left, the family huddled together in the center of the attic. No one suggested using the precious candle. They sat in darkness, feeling each other's presence. "We will survive this," Jakob finally whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion and determination. "All of us." But the sound of boots remained in their ears long afterward. A phantom echo that never fully faded. They became shadows, living phantoms in a world growing increasingly hostile to their existence. Each day brought new adaptations, new tolerances for discomfort, new definitions of what it meant to survive. They moved only at night, when darkness fell and the city was under curfew. When the only sounds were distant patrols and the occasional stray dog, they would carefully, silently stretch their cramped limbs. They developed a choreography of movement, taking turns to stand upright in the center of the attic where the ceiling was highest. 5 minutes per person, a luxury of vertical existence, spoke only in whispers. Language itself became precious, measured, conserved like water or food. They reduced communication to essential information, to comfort, to prayer. Unnecessary words died in their throats. David, once chatty and inquisitive, grew eerily accustomed to silence. He developed a system of hand signals, elaborate, sophisticated gestures that conveyed basic needs or observations without sound. Every footstep, every cough, every mouse in the wall became a threat. Their senses sharpened to preternatural levels. Leia could distinguish between the sound of Marek's tread on the stairs and that of his neighbor. She could identify patrol schedules by the cadence of boots on cobblestones 3 stories below. She knew the difference between the normal settling noises of the old building and the sounds that signaled danger. Spring arrived according to the calendar, but barely penetrated their hidden world. A shaft of sunlight occasionally broke through a crack in the roof, and they would take turns sitting in its warm path, faces upturned like flowers. David developed a game of trying to catch dust motes dancing in these rare beams, his thin fingers grasping at golden particles. Leah scratched tally marks into a beam. The seasons passed in silence, rain, then snow, then blossoms they couldn't touch. 100 days. 200. The marks became a visual calendar of their confinement, a tangible record that time still existed, still moved forward, even as their lives remained suspended. Summer brought new challenges. The attic, poorly ventilated and directly under the roof, became an oven during July and August. The heat was suffocating, pressing down on them like a physical weight. They stripped to undergarments, lay as still as possible, and tried not to touch each other. Sweat pooled and dried, leaving salt rings on the wood beneath them. The thirst was torturous. Water, always rationed carefully, became even more precious. They sucked on small pebbles Marek brought, anything to stimulate saliva when water couldn't be spared. The heat brought insects, flies buzzing maddeningly, mosquitoes that left welts they couldn't scratch for fear of making noise. Occasionally, a wasp would find its way in, causing minutes of breathless terror as they waited for it to find its way out again. Hygiene became increasingly difficult. They washed with dampened rags, using water so sparingly that they were never truly clean. Their clothes, worn for days at a time, hung on their thinning frames. Hair went unwashed, then uncut, becoming matted and dull. Teeth were cleaned with salt when available, with fingers when not. Through it all, Marek remained their lifeline. Every other night, he would silently deliver what provisions he could secure. Food that grew increasingly scarce as rationing tightened across the occupied territories. Sometimes it was only a potato, a handful of beans, a crust of bread. Once, miraculously, an egg, which Esther divided into precise quarters, each person savoring the richness as if it were the finest delicacy. Marek also brought news, whispered quickly during his brief visits. The war continued. The Germans pushed eastward into Russia. America remained neutral. Britain was being bombed. The ghettos were being emptied systematically, their inhabitants sent east on trains that never returned. Leah's journal became her lifeline. When the candle could be spared, usually just for minutes after Marek's visits, she would write furiously, recording not just their daily existence, but her innermost thoughts, dreams that sustained her through the monotony of hiding. Day 148. I dream of grass beneath my feet, of sunlight, of music, and of dancing without fear. Today I remembered the Chopin nocturne my music teacher used to play. I hummed it silently, moving only my lips, and for a moment I was back in the school hall with the windows open and spring air rushing in. Day 162. David has started drawing maps from memory, our street, the school route, the path to grandmother's house. His recall is astonishing. Papa says he has a photographic memory. I wonder if these places still exist as we remember them, or if they've been transformed beyond recognition. Day 179. Mama's cough is worse. She tries to hide it, but I can feel her body shake beside me at night. Marek promised medicine next time. I'm afraid for her. For all of us, if she gets truly sick, there is no doctor we can call, no hospital that would take us. We are on our own in every sense. She once believed life could be paused, that they could step out of the world temporarily and then rejoin it when safety returned. But here, time bled together. They were not living, they were waiting, and waiting had become its own kind of existence, suspended between life and death, present and future, horror and hope. Jakob maintained structure where he could. He instituted school hours, during which he would teach David mathematics and history in whispers. Esther taught literature and language, reciting poems and stories from memory. Leah took charge of science. On day 216, Marek didn't come. The familiar sequence of 3 soft knocks, followed by 2 harder ones, never arrived, and the small bundle of food and news that had become their lifeline remained absent. Leah sat cross-legged near the hatch, listening intently for any sound from below, her ears straining against the silence. Her stomach growled. They had rationed the previous day's bread in anticipation of today's delivery, and now only crumbs remained. As darkness fell completely, her heart pounded with such force she was certain Jakob could hear it from across the attic. "He's just late," David whispered hopefully, his young face illuminated by a sliver of moonlight cutting through their tiny window. "Remember last month? When he couldn't come until midnight because of the patrols?" Leah nodded, offering her brother a reassuring smile that didn't reach her eyes. Esther simply rocked back and forth in the corner, lips moving in silent prayer, her thin fingers working anxiously at the frayed edges of her shawl. The night dragged on endlessly. Every creak in the building made them freeze. Every distant voice on the street made them hold their breath. But the hatch remained closed. The next night, still nothing. The attic felt smaller somehow, the air heavier with their unspoken fears. Jakob paced the length of their hiding place, 7 steps east, 7 steps west, a caged animal growing more desperate with each passing hour. Twice he approached the hatch, his hand hovering over it, before Esther's sharp whisper pulled him back. "It's too dangerous," she hissed. "If they've taken him, they could be watching the apartment." Leah's journal lay open in her lap, but her pencil remained still. What was there to write when the words themselves felt too heavy to lift? "Where are you, Marek?" she thought. "What's happened to you?" On the 3rd night, Jakob whispered, "Something's wrong." The certainty in his voice sent chills through Leah's body. They had known, of course. All of them had known since that first missed visit. But hearing the words spoken aloud made them real in a way silence had not. David began to cry softly, and Esther pulled him close, shushing him gently. "We don't know anything for certain," she murmured, though her voice quavered with doubt. Desperation drove them to risk peeking through a gap in the floorboards, a narrow space where 2 boards had warped slightly with age and humidity. They'd never dared use it before. The danger far outweighed any momentary comfort visibility might bring. But now they needed to know. Jakob went first, lying flat on his stomach, one eye pressed to the gap. Leah watched his back stiffen. "What is it?" she whispered. "Can you see anything?" When he rolled away, his face was ashen. Marek's apartment below was dark, cold, empty. He swallowed hard. The place has been searched. Things are overturned. It was Leah's turn next. The gap offered only a thin slice of vision, enough to see the corner of Marek's small table, a chair knocked onto its side, papers scattered across the floor. The sight stole her breath. In their 18 months of hiding, Marek's apartment had represented order, safety, their last connection to normality. Now it looked violated, ransacked, a visual echo of what had happened to their own home when the Nazis had come. Worst of all was not what she could see, but what she couldn't. Marek himself. The kind man with the silvering beard and gentle hands who smuggled them food, news, and sometimes, most precious of all, hope. 5 days passed before they heard the neighbors talking, voices through the walls, muffled but unmistakable. They pressed their ears against the thin plaster, struggling to catch every word. "Marek Zielinski," a woman's voice said, "arrested for hiding Jews." The words hit like physical blows. Esther gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sound. David began to cry again, no longer attempting to quiet his sobs. Jakob turned away, his shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible weight. Leah stayed perfectly still, listening as the conversation continued, hoping for any scrap of information that might suggest Marek was alive, that he might return. But the neighbors moved on to other topics: the price of bread, the latest German edicts, the advancing Russian front, leaving Marek's fate suspended in terrible ambiguity. Later that night, as the others slept fitfully, Leah sat with her journal open in her lap but didn't write. Her pencil hovered above the page, trembling slightly in her grip. What was there to say? How could words possibly contain what Marek had meant to them? He wasn't just their protector, he was their window to the world, their touchstone to humanity in a time when such connections were severed daily. The blank page seemed to mock her inability to capture his sacrifice. Finally, she wrote simply, "Day 221. Marek is gone." The letters blurred as tears finally came, silent and hot on her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, not wanting to stain the precious paper. Marek had saved their lives. And now he was gone. In the twisted logic of Nazi occupation, his goodness had become his crime, his compassion, his death sentence. Leah wondered if he had revealed their hiding place under torture, then immediately felt ashamed for even considering it. Even if he had, how could she blame him? And if he hadn't, if he had carried their secret to whatever fate awaited him, how could they ever repay such a debt? The next morning brought no relief, only the stark reality of their new situation. Their food supplies would last perhaps another week if strictly rationed. Their water jug was half empty. The chamber pot needed emptying. All tasks Marek had helped with, problems he had solved. "We'll have to go down," Jakob said finally, "at night, just to get supplies." "What if they're watching?" Esther asked, voicing the fear they all shared. "Then we starve here instead," he replied simply. That night they lit a candle, one of their last 3, and held hands in a tight circle. Jacob said Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. None of them knew for certain if Marek was dead, but they all felt the finality of his absence. "Yit gadal v'yit kadash shimei rabba," Jacob began, his voice strong despite everything. David stumbled over the ancient Aramaic words, but Leah and Esther's voices carried him through. The prayer mentioned neither death nor grief explicitly, but rather praised God's name in the world. It was a strange comfort, speaking these words that connected them to generations past, to a community now scattered and hunted. When they finished, silence settled over them once more, but it felt different somehow, less hollow, more resolved. They had lost their protector, their friend, their link to the world outside. The future stretched before them, darker and more uncertain than ever. They were alone now in a way they hadn't been before, alone in their attic island, surrounded by a hostile sea of occupation, alone with their hunger, their fear, their dwindling supplies, but not broken, never broken. Leah finally wrote in her journal that night, by the dying light of the candle, "Day 222. We said Kaddish for Marek tonight. I don't know if he was Jewish, but I think he would have understood. Tomorrow we must be braver than we've ever been. For him. For each other." She closed the journal and tucked it beneath her thin blanket. Outside, Krakow continued its troubled sleep under occupation. Inside their attic sanctuary, 4 hearts beat on, weary, grieving, but alive. And in that moment, survival itself became an act of defiance. The hunger was constant now, no longer a visitor, but a resident. It had taken up permanent residence in their bodies, hollowing out their cheeks and sharpening their collarbones to knife-like points beneath thin fabric. Hunger was the first thing they felt upon waking and the last sensation that accompanied them into fitful sleep. It manifested differently in each of them. In David, it brought a listless silence that replaced his once cheerful chatter. In Esther, a perpetual tremor in her hands. In Jakob, a haunted distance in his eyes as he calculated and recalculated their dwindling supplies. For Leah, hunger was both enemy and teacher. It taught her how much the human body could endure. It showed her the surprising strength hidden beneath her increasingly fragile frame. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, She would lie awake, listening to the symphony of empty stomachs around her, the groans and gurgles forming a hunger chorus that seemed loud enough to betray their hiding place. 3 weeks had passed since Marek's disappearance, 3 weeks of stretching each morsel to its breaking point. The last potato had been eaten 5 days ago, shaved into paper-thin slices and divided with mathematical precision. The final spoonful of flour had been mixed with water yesterday to create a paste that did little to quiet their complaining stomachs. Jakob paced the attic floor, 7 steps east, 7 steps west, his movements growing more agitated with each passing hour. Finally, as midnight approached and the building fell silent, he stopped before them. "We have no choice," he said simply. "I'm going down." Esther clutched his arm. The Gestapo could still be watching Marek's apartment. It's too dangerous. "We'll die in here otherwise," Jakob replied, his voice flat with certainty. "I'll be careful." They argued in hushed whispers, but the decision had already been made. Hunger had forced their hand. Jakob waited until the distant church bells struck 2, the dead hour when even patrols grew lazy and inattentive, before gently lifting the hatch. The others held their breath as he disappeared into the darkness below, each second of his absence stretching painfully. Leah counted heartbeats, reaching nearly 3,000 before the hatch opened again, and Jakob's head appeared, followed by a small cloth bundle. Jakob ventured downstairs late that night, risking everything. He crept into Marek's abandoned apartment, searching cupboards and floorboards. He returned with a bag of flour, 2 cans of beans, and a half-full jar of pickles. His hands trembled as he displayed these treasures on their blanket. "Marek had a hiding place beneath the sink," he whispered. "I think he was saving these for us." The thought brought tears to Esther's eyes. Even in his absence, their friend was caring for them. That night, they allowed themselves a small feast, a spoonful of beans each, the brine from 1 pickle shared between them. It tasted of life itself. But by the 4th day, their bounty was dwindling again. The calculation was simple and merciless. 4 people, 3 more days of food at most. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Leah watched Jakob's face grow more haggard as he contemplated another descent. His last journey had aged him. The strain of moving silently through danger had left new lines around his eyes. Leah stepped forward during their whispered counsel. "I'll go next time," she said, her voice soft but firm. "No," Jakob replied immediately, the single syllable sharp with protective instinct. But Esther placed a hand on his arm, her practical nature asserting itself through their fear. "She's small, quiet, careful," Esther reasoned. "She might notice things you missed." "I won't go into other apartments," Leah promised, though privately she had already resolved to do whatever necessary. "Just Marek's again." Jakob relented with obvious reluctance. That night, he showed Leah how to lift the hatch without sound, how to test each floorboard before trusting it with her weight. "If you hear anything at all, come back immediately," he instructed. Leah became their forager after that first successful mission yielded half a loaf of stale bread from behind Marek's bookshelf. She moved like smoke, silent, invisible, her body seeming to know instinctively which shadows would hide her best. She waited until the building slept, then slipped into the halls like a ghost, her footsteps so light they barely disturbed the dust. She searched empty apartments when she dared, listening at doors for long minutes before trying their handles. She scavenged the cellar where residents stored preserved foods, taking only small amounts from different containers so no single theft would be noticeable. She dug through trash bins like an animal, swallowing her pride along with the scraps she recovered. The first time she emerged from the building into the small back courtyard, the night air hit her lungs like fire after so many months of attic dust. She stood frozen, terrified and exhilarated by the vastness of the open sky above her. Then she spotted the vegetable peels discarded by a neighbor and returned to her mission. She once found a half-rotted apple in that courtyard and nearly wept with joy. She carried it back triumphantly, cradling it like a jewel. They cut away the brown parts and divided the remaining flesh into 4 precise portions, each barely a mouthful. David closed his eyes as he chewed his piece, as if committing the taste to memory. With each successful forage, Leah grew bolder, venturing farther from their sanctuary. With each return, she grew thinner. Her collarbones cast deep shadows across her chest. Her once thick hair fell out in clumps when she ran her fingers through it. Her clothes hung from her frame like flags on a windless day. But she survived. They all did. Each day was a victory against the odds, each morsel of food a battle won in their private war against annihilation. In her journal, by the weak light of a candle stub that represented another dwindling resource, she wrote, "Day 295. I stole food today. I am not ashamed. Tomorrow I will steal again." This is what survival has become, taking what others discard or forget. I wonder if there will come a time when I can sit at a table again, with a full plate before me, and remember how to eat without counting each bite, without saving a portion for tomorrow. I wonder if such abundance could ever feel normal again. She didn't share these thoughts with the others. Instead, she simply brought home whatever she could find and added it to their stores with quiet determination. Her night vision had improved remarkably. Another adaptation, another tool for survival. Sometimes she imagined she could smell food through walls, her senses heightened by constant hunger. Jakob watched her with worried eyes each time she prepared to leave, and welcomed her back with silent embraces that conveyed both gratitude and guilt that she had taken on this dangerous role. Esther taught her to make soup from potato peels and water, to extract every possible calorie from their meager findings. David made her smile by pretending each meal was a feast at a fine restaurant, describing imaginary courses with elaborate flourishes. They endured. Day after day, they endured. One night, while cleaning near the far wall of the attic, Leah discovered a loose floorboard. It shifted slightly under her weight as she swept away months of accumulated dust. Curious, she pressed her fingers along its edge and felt it give. With a quick glance to ensure the others were occupied with their evening tasks, Esther mending a sock for the third time, Jacob teaching David multiplication tables in whispers. She worked her fingernails beneath the board and gently pried it upward. The space beneath was shallow but deliberate, a small hiding place perhaps 6 inches deep and a foot square. Within it, wrapped carefully in a piece of faded cloth that might once have been blue, was a folded piece of paper. Leah extracted it carefully, conscious of its fragility. The paper was thin, already yellowing at the edges despite its protected location. A letter, addressed to Marek in elegantly sloped handwriting that made Leah's heart stop in her chest. In her father's handwriting, the familiar loops and angles of his script transported her instantly to their dining room table, to peaceful evenings before the war when he would sit composing correspondence by lamplight, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. How many times had she delivered his letters to the post office, proud to be trusted with such important errands? With trembling fingers, she unfolded the single page. The letter was brief but precise, dated just days after they had first hidden in the attic. Her father must have written it during those first fraught hours of adjustment to their new reality, understanding even then the precariousness of their situation. "Dear Marek," it began, the formal address belying the depth of trust implied by their arrangement. "If you are reading this, something has happened to prevent me from telling you these things directly. First, my eternal gratitude for sheltering my family. There are no words in any language to adequately express what this means to us." Leah bit her lip, fighting back tears as her father's voice seemed to rise from the page. "Second, practical matters. Whatever small possessions we brought with us are yours to dispose of as you see fit. The gold pocket watch was my father's. Sell it if necessary, but if circumstances allow, I would be grateful if you could keep it for David to have some day." Leah remembered the watch, the way her father would wind it each evening, the soft click of its case opening and closing. She wondered if Marek had managed to keep it safe, or if it had been discovered when the Gestapo came. The letter continued with similar instructions about their few remaining valuables. Her mother's pearl earrings, a silver kiddush cup, before shifting to its final paragraph. "If we do not survive," it read, the handwriting growing slightly more urgent here, pressing harder into the paper, "tell them we were here. Tell them we lived. Tell them we were human. Tell them Esther sang to the children each night, that Jacob could recite Pushkin from memory, that Leah wrote stories that made us forget our circumstances for precious moments, that David could solve mathematics problems beyond his years." Tell them we loved and argued and dreamed and hoped until the very end. The signature was simple. Your grateful friend, Benjamin Kalman. Leah pressed the letter to her chest, holding it there as if it could somehow connect her physically to her father, to his wishes, to his voice. The paper crinkled against her heartbeat. Then carefully, reverently, she tucked it into the back of her journal, sliding it between the last written page and the leather cover. She replaced the floorboard exactly as she had found it, this hiding place within a hiding place, now empty of its treasure but full of meaning. She didn't immediately tell the others about her discovery. This letter felt intensely personal, a message from their past to a future they might never see. They had no gravestone, no memorial, no formal record of their existence in this attic above a city being systematically emptied of its Jewish population. Official documents listed them as relocated, or perhaps already processed, euphemisms for murder that the Germans were so fond of using. This letter would be their proof, their testimony, their assertion that they had continued to be fully human even as the world outside tried to strip them of their humanity. Later that week, during one of their quiet evening conversations, whispered exchanges that helped maintain their sanity in the endless confinement, Leah finally shared her discovery. She read her father's words aloud, her voice catching on certain phrases. When she finished, silence filled the attic. It was David who spoke first. "Do you think anyone will ever know we were here?" he asked, the question painfully direct in the way only children can manage. "Yes," Jacob answered firmly, "we will tell them ourselves when this is over." None of them acknowledged the fragile hope in his statement, the assumption that any of them would survive to tell their story. Instead, they each touched the letter as it passed between them, a tactile connection to Benjamin, to their former lives, to the possibility of being remembered. That night, Leah added to her journal, Day 310. Found father's letter to Marek today. He wanted the world to know we remained human. I am trying, Father, even as hunger and fear gnaw at us, I am trying to remember what that means. Spring 1941 arrived with soft rain and pale sunlight through the attic's window. The single small pane of glass, clouded with grime and cobwebs, nonetheless admitted enough light to mark the changing season. Leah stood beneath it one morning, face upturned to catch the weak sunbeams, feeling the subtle shift in the air that signaled winter's retreat. In their attic sanctuary, seasons blurred together, marked more by changes in temperature than by calendar dates. Winter had been brutal, the cold seeping through walls and floorboards to settle in their bones, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, their fingers and toes perpetually numb despite huddling together beneath every scrap of fabric they possessed. They had survived on body heat and whispered stories of warmer days. Now spring brought its own challenges. The attic heated quickly under the sun, becoming stifling by midday. The air grew thick with dust and the mingled scents of unwashed bodies. Insects found their way through invisible cracks, drawn to their meager food supplies and the salt of their skin. Yet there was beauty too in this season of renewal. Leah watched a spider construct an intricate web in the corner of the window, its delicate architecture catching sunlight like strands of glass. Birds returned to nest in the eaves above them, their morning songs providing unexpected comfort. Leah counted her 18th birthday silently as April began. No announcement, no celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement as she made another mark in her journal. 18 in normal times would have meant adulthood, university perhaps, maybe even courtship. In the attic, it meant nothing except another day of survival. She found herself thinking of her friends from before. Sophia with her quick laugh and ambitious plans to become a doctor. Michal, who played violin with such passion. Aaron, who had once kissed her behind the school when they were 15, his lips tasting of apple and cinnamon. Where were they now? Had they escaped? Were they hiding like her family? Or had they already been taken to the camps they'd heard whispered about? Places with names like Auschwitz and Treblinka that carried an almost mythical terror. David turned 12 that April, an occasion they couldn't let pass unmarked, despite their circumstances. For weeks beforehand, they each prepared secret gifts from the nothing they possessed. Leah crafted a candle from old wax drippings she'd collected during her foraging expeditions, carefully melting them together and fashioning a new wick from threads pulled from her hem. Jakob created a set of chess pieces carved from bits of wood scavenged from the building's trash, each piece rough but recognizable. Esther managed to bake a tiny cake using flour and water, sweetened with a precious spoonful of sugar Leah had found during one of her nighttime searches. No eggs, no milk, no proper flavoring, yet it was a miracle of ingenuity. On the morning of his birthday, they woke David with soft singing. Happy birthday in whispers that wouldn't carry beyond their walls but filled the attic with momentary joy. His eyes widened at the small cake with its single candle, at the homemade chess set, at the card Leah had drawn showing their family standing together outside their old home. David smiled like it was the best gift he'd ever received. Though Leah remembered previous birthdays with proper presents wrapped in colored paper, with friends invited to celebrate, with their mother's special chocolate cake topped with 12 perfect candles. Make a wish, Esther whispered as David prepared to blow out the tiny flame. He closed his eyes for a long moment before extinguishing the candle with a careful breath. I can't tell you what I wished for, he said seriously, or it won't come true. They all nodded, respecting this childhood superstition that had somehow survived alongside them, a fragile remnant of normalcy. Later, as David and Jacob played chess with the new pieces, Leah asked her brother quietly, "Was it a good birthday?" David considered the question with a maturity beyond his 12 years. "It's good that we're all still here together," he finally answered. "That's what matters now." Outside, the world groaned with war. Russian and Allied bombing raids sometimes rattled their attic, sending dust cascading from the rafters as explosions thundered in the distance. Rumors of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising reached them through a neighbor's whispered conversation that Leah overheard during a foraging trip. Jews fighting back with smuggled weapons and desperate courage, choosing to die on their feet rather than on their knees. The news kindled something in Jakob. "We should prepare," he told them that night. "If the Russians break through, if there's a chance to escape." He didn't finish the thought, but they understood. If opportunity came, they needed to be ready to seize it. They began to gather supplies with new purpose. An extra can here, a sturdy pair of shoes there, a knife with a dull blade that Leah sharpened painstakingly against a stone. Jakob created a small map based on their memories of Krakow, marking possible routes out of the city. Esther sewed hidden pockets into their clothing to carry what little they had. But the attic remained unchanged. A box above a city of ghosts, their entire world reduced to dimensions they could cross in seconds. 7 steps east to west, 5 steps north to south. A space barely large enough to stand upright in its center, sloping sharply at the edges where the roof met the floor. Sometimes Leah wondered if the outside world still existed at all, or if it had disappeared while they hid, leaving only this attic floating in an endless void. The thought came most often in the deepest part of night, when reality itself seemed tenuous, when the boundaries between memory and dream blurred. Day 450, she wrote in her journal by candlelight. I dreamed I was outside, lying in the grass. The blades were cool and sharp against my skin. The sky stretched forever above me, so vast it hurt to look at it. Birds crossed from one edge to another, free in a way I can hardly remember. I didn't want to wake up. She closed the journal carefully, preserving the pencil lead that grew shorter with each entry. Outside their window, spring advanced toward summer, indifferent to their hidden struggle, to the war that raged across continents, to the systematic destruction of an entire people. Life persisted in the vines that climbed the building's exterior, in the insects that found their way inside, in the 4 hearts that continued beating against all odds in their attic sanctuary. January 1945 arrived with snow and silence. The attic was bitterly cold again, their breath hanging in the air like ghosts of words unspoken. They had survived a second winter in hiding, their bodies grown accustomed to perpetual hunger, their minds adapted to confinement. Nearly 2 years had passed since they first climbed into this space, 700 days of whispering, waiting, hoping. The war had changed. They could sense it in the increased bombing raids, in the frantic energy of German patrols on the streets below, in the rumors Leah gathered during her increasingly bold foraging expeditions. "The Russians are coming," neighbors whispered. "The Germans are preparing to retreat." Hope was dangerous. They had learned this early in their confinement. Hope could lead to carelessness, to mistakes, to detection. Better to focus on the immediate needs of survival, the next meal, the next day, the next breath. Yet hope crept in nonetheless, tenacious as the weeds that pushed through cracks in the sidewalk below. They were playing a silent game of checkers with Jakob's handmade pieces when they heard them. Boots again, but they were different, heavier, messier. Not the precise, terrifying rhythm of German jackboots, but something chaotic, urgent. The sound of many men moving quickly, shouting in a language that wasn't German. Then Russian voices, unmistakable in their distinctive cadence and harsh consonants. The four of them froze, the checker game forgotten. Jakob pressed his finger to his lips, though no warning was necessary. They had perfected silence as an art form, had learned to communicate with gestures and expressions when even whispers felt too dangerous. Hours passed as the commotion below continued. Gunfire erupted sporadically, sharp cracks that made them flinch each time despite their long acquaintance with such sounds. Orders were shouted, doors kicked open, furniture overturned, then footsteps on the stairs leading to their floor. Heavy boots moving with purpose toward the trapdoor that connected their attic to the apartment below. They huddled together in the farthest corner, eyes wide, hearts pounding. This moment had populated their nightmares for months. Discovery, exposure, capture. The hatch opened. A beam of light swept across the attic, momentarily blinding them after so long in dimness. When Leah's vision cleared, she saw a man in a uniform unlike the dreaded black of the SS or the field grey of the Wehrmacht. This was something different, a bulky tan coat with a red star visible on the Ushanka hat pushed back on his head. A soldier looked down at them, stunned. His rifle fell slack in his hands as he took in the scene. Four emaciated figures pressed together against the wall, their clothes hanging from skeletal frames, their eyes huge in gaunt faces. "Boże mój," he breathed, the Russian exclamation soft with shock. They didn't move at first. After so long hiding, after so many close calls, after building their entire existence around remaining unseen, the instinct to shrink from view was overwhelming. David clutched Esther's sleeve, his knuckles white. Jacob moved slightly forward, positioning himself between the soldier and his family in a gesture of protection that was purely symbolic. He had no weapons, no strength to fight. Leah was the first to speak. Her voice was dry and hoarse from disuse, emerging as little more than a whisper after days of silence. "Are we free?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with a desperate hope none of them had dared articulate until this moment. The soldier's face, young beneath a layer of grime and stubble, softened. He nodded slowly, deliberately, making sure they understood. "Da," he said, then switched to heavily accented German. "German's gone. You safe now." Safe. The word seemed to belong to another language, another lifetime. Leah couldn't quite grasp its meaning. The soldier called to others. More faces appeared at the hatch, more expressions of shock and pity. Someone extended a hand. After a moment's hesitation, Jakob took it. They descended into a new world. The apartment below, Marek's apartment, was transformed. The familiar furniture was overturned or missing entirely. The walls were marked with bullet holes. The windows were shattered, letting in cold January air that felt shockingly fresh after the stale atmosphere of the attic. A Russian officer offered them water from his canteen. The metal rim felt strange against Leah's lips, the water itself almost painfully cold and clean compared to the stagnant supply they had rationed for so long. David drank too quickly and vomited, his stomach unaccustomed to such sudden abundance. They emerged onto the street, blinking in daylight that seemed unnaturally bright despite the overcast winter sky. Krakow was rubble. Streets were lined with ash, shops gone, faces hollow. Russian tanks rumbled past, their engines deafening after years of trained sensitivity to the slightest sound. Soldiers moved in groups, weapons ready, eyes alert for German snipers or last stands. But the sky, after 700 days in hiding, was impossibly blue. Leah tilted her head back and stared directly into it, feeling vertigo wash over her at its vastness. No boundaries, no walls, no ceiling, just endless space stretching in all directions. "Where will we go?" David asked, his voice small against the enormity of their freedom. Jakob looked around at the devastated city, at the other stunned civilians emerging from hiding places or returning from forced labor. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we're together. We survived." Leah clutched her journal to her chest, the record of their ordeal, the proof of their endurance, the testament to their humanity that her father had asked for in his letter. She would add one final entry that night, by the light of a proper lamp in a Russian field hospital. Day 701. We are free. The world is in ruins around us, and nothing will ever be the same. But we are alive to witness it. We carried our stories through the darkness. Now we must learn how to live in the light again.